Today we're going to be talking about the respiratory system, and specifically we're going to be talking about the parts of the respiratory system. In order to talk about the respiratory system, we first have to talk about what does the respiratory system do. Many of you probably know that the respiratory system includes your lungs, but it includes a lot of other things. So the first thing we're going to write down in our notebook is that the respiratory system is a network of organs that help you breathe, which is probably something that you already knew. Our big question in this unit is, why do we need to breathe? People will tell me, oh, you need oxygen. Your cells need oxygen. My question to you is why? Why do your cells need oxygen? What do they do with that oxygen? And why is it so important? That's what we're going to be looking at. So the purpose is to exchange oxygen and CO2, CO2 being carbon dioxide. And to exchange means to bring in one and get rid of another. So bring in oxygen, get rid of CO2. Our other big question is, where does this CO2 come from? We know we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out CO2, but where does it come from? We're going to find that out. And the other system is to convert sugar into usable energy. You're like, sugar? That's with food we eat. That's our digestive system. Yeah, we're going to talk about what happens to sugar once it gets to your cells. What do your cells do to convert it into energy? And this has to do with the respiratory system, believe it or not. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So we're going to talk about the parts of the respiratory system now that we know what the respiratory system does. Now, there's a diagram that goes along with this. I can get you the diagram. Just ask me for it when you get back to school. So parts of the respiratory system: nostrils, your nose. We all know that our nose is useful because it helps us breathe, right? It brings in air from the outside of the body into the body. The cool thing about the nose is it actually is different from the mouth. So breathing through your nose is different from breathing through your mouth. And on the next slide, I'm going to explain why there's a big difference. With your nose, your nasal passage, so you see it labeled number 2 here. Think the inside of your nose. It helps because it filters, it warms, and it moistens the incoming air. So you have little hairs in your nose. Those help you filter things. When stuff gets into your nose, like let's say you go into a really dusty room, you end up sneezing because those little hairs get tickled and say, hey, stuff is getting into your nose. It also helps warm up the air. And then it adds a little bit of moisture as well. So your mouth doesn't necessarily do this, but your nose does. Now, once air goes in through your nose, we're going to say it goes in through your nose. We know we can breathe through our mouth too, all right? It's going to head to the back of the throat here. And we have a name for that. We call that the pharynx. It's this whole region in the back of your throat and the back of your nasal passage. If you take another biology class, maybe one in college, you'll learn that there are different names for different parts of the pharynx. The nasopharynx is the part on the top, the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx, but you don't need to know these different pharynx words. So the back of the throat. We talked about this in the digestive system unit a little bit. We have a flap, right? When we swallow food, we don't want food to go into our lungs. But when we're breathing, we're not eating or drinking, this little flap is open. And this flap is called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is the flap that prevents the food from entering the trachea, and the trachea is the tube that goes to your lungs. So this little flap on our diagram here is number 4, and you can see it on this diagram, right, where the flap bends down to cover the trachea. So this is the esophagus on the right, and then the trachea. All right, so we know that the word epi means over or above, right? Like epidermis, the outermost layer. And so the epiglottis is the flap above the glottis. Now the glottis is a silly term, in my opinion. It's just the opening, like it's not an actual part, it's just the opening in the trachea. It's just the part of the trachea under the epiglottis. In this diagram, you see it's number 5 underneath that flap. So it's just part of the passageway underneath the epiglottis. Then we get to the larynx, your voice box, your vocal cords. And your voice box is actually these 2 little membranes that vibrate against each other. This video is not going to work, but there are 2 little flaps that vibrate. Let's see if I can refresh here. You'll see these are the 2 flaps, and what happens is they vibrate, they open and close, and that creates sound. So air is passing through and causing these flaps to then shake back and forth, and that creates sound. So then we move to the trachea, your windpipe. If you feel on your neck where your throat is, you can actually feel these rings of cartilage, right? It feels bumpy. And the reason it has this cartilage is the same stuff that your nose and your ear is made out of. It has that cartilage so that it can keep that trachea open so it doesn't collapse. A collapsed trachea would be bad because then we couldn't get air in. So the trachea is your windpipe. It has rings of cartilage. So our trachea then divides into 2 sections. One's going to go to the right lung, one's going to go to the left lung. And those 2 divisions are called bronchi. Think about a road and it splits into 2. So bronchi. If you ever hear one is called one bronchus, but we don't really talk about that. We just say the bronchi. So the bronchi, 2 major branches from the trachea. So it kind of looks like tree trunks or tree branches here, and they're going to keep branching out into smaller and smaller divisions. So below that, we have the bronchial tubes. And let me go back to this picture really quickly. But you can see, right, we have these smaller branches now. So these are the bronchial tubes. So we can see bronchi. The bronchial tubes are just the smaller divisions off of there. And so number 9 here is just bronchial tubes. Smaller divisions coming off of the, and I'm going to change this to bronchi. Or bronchus, right? One bronchus. And then they divide even further. And the tiniest little ones are called bronchioles, okay? So bronchi, bronchial tubes, bronchioles. So it just keeps going smaller and smaller. Now, eventually, we get at the end of these really tiny divisions, we get little air sacs. So we're going to be zooming in here to the alveoli. Alveoli are air sacs, right? We've looked a little tiny bit of them in our circulatory system unit. these little sacs, they kind of look like a cluster of grapes. It's just a bunch of membranes together, little sacs. This is where our blood vessels are connecting. And this is where oxygen's going into our bloodstream and CO2 is coming in. Remember our capillaries? So the capillaries are around these little tiny air sacs at the end of all of these little tubes, these bronchioles. And so this is where, when you breathe in, goes into your lungs all the way to the end of the little tiny tubes to these air sacs, and then the oxygen goes into your bloodstream. And on the way, right, in these little sacs, they pick up the CO2 that your blood cells drop off, and then you breathe it out. So capillaries, the little tiny blood vessels that attach to the alveoli. So we're getting close to the end here. We just have a couple more. So we need to be able to breathe, right? How do we breathe? Well, there's a muscle underneath our rib cage that helps us breathe, and it's called the diaphragm. We'll talk about how breathing works in a little bit, but the diaphragm is the muscle below the lungs, and it helps you breathe. And so you'll see this in this picture, it's shaded gray. This is number 13, and it's underneath the diaphragm. Now, we included the esophagus here. You already have this definition in your digestive system, so you don't really need to write this definition down again. But you'll notice the esophagus here kind of travels behind the trachea. And the esophagus is different because that tube can collapse. It doesn't need to stay open, so it doesn't have rings of cartilage. But that esophagus is going to go behind your lungs there. And then, last but not least, you have a membrane covering your lungs. And the reason we need to have a membrane is this membrane kind of makes the lungs slimy on the outside, which I know sounds gross. But remember, these lungs are expanding and contracting, expanding, contracting. And so if they're not slimy and wet, what happens is they start rubbing against other stuff inside your body and creating a lot of friction. That wouldn't feel very good. So stuff has membranes to make it like slimy and wet inside so it can move really easily.